Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to a Monday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is the 28th day of August in the year 2017. It is a pleasure to begin a new broadcast week here at the Virtual Center. Unfortunately, of course, we're presenting it in a tragic weather situation that is affecting our friends in Texas. And in fact, one of the people from there that is on my Facebook page let us know this morning that her power went out, and I have my stepson living in San Antonio, and his wife currently is battling. Well, actually, she's pretty close to the end of the battle with stage 4 cancer, and he's going through some horrible situations. They've got hospice in now with her. And it just seemed so unfortunate to me that, in the midst of all of that, to have to deal with the weather situation. So I kind of touched base with him via Facebook on Saturday evening, and was kind of inquiring about how the weather's affecting them and all of that. And he told me at that point, as of Saturday night in outside San Antonio, that he still had power and that the flooding in his region, his area, was minimal. But as you look at the weather maps, it's very clear that San Antonio is right in the line of fire. So I'm kind of guessing right now that things may not be quite as good now as they were Saturday night for him, and I'm a little bit concerned about him. This morning during the one of the national weather one of the national weather forecasters was talking about the storm and giving the amount of rain that already had fallen in many places. And one of the places mentioned was a suburb of Houston called Baytown. And I'm kind of familiar with Baytown a little bit because my wife, first wife, Joan, her mom retired there and lived in Baytown. And we had gone down there 2 or 3 times to visit her. She passed away several years ago, and but we had gone down there to visit her, and they were relatives. My wife Joan had cousins in the region and all of that. And I saw this morning that Baytown had already received 34 inches of rain. And I thought, oh my God. And I remember very well what the community was like, and the fact that it was so level, so flat, so right at sea level, if not a little bit below it. And I thought, oh my heavens, that area would be devastated because there's no hills. It's just so flat. And again, I think as you look at the flow as the weather maps show us, with the flow of the water coming off the Gulf and just sucking up all of that warm water from the Gulf, the water is obviously warmer than it's ever been, and it's just dumping it on an area. And of course, the Houston area is, I mean, we won't say it's one giant slab of concrete, but in reality, that's, figuratively speaking, that's what it's become. And the reality is there's no place for the water to be absorbed. And of course, this amount of water you couldn't absorb anyway. But and it just flows back, and it just accumulates and flows back into the Gulf, and the weather pattern just continually picks it up and brings it back over land, and it's just continuing. It's just awful. And I think all of us are stunned by. I mean, it's beyond a natural disaster. It is absolutely stunning in the magnitude of this. I mean, the headline, I checked the New York Times online before we came on the air about 20 minutes ago, and the headline in the New York Times refers to the fact that 6.6 million people in the Houston area are absolutely imprisoned by this. I mean, there's nothing they can do. There's no place they can go. It is just absolutely awful. And I mentioned this. I can't say anything that we haven't already heard and read about. But all I can do is join all of you I know and just hoping that somehow things will improve even a little bit for those folks. But again, welcome to our program here at the Virtual Center on this Monday. I am elated. We were able to get a full week of broadcasting in last week, and barring some unforeseen circumstances this week, it's looking pretty good for me as well. It's unbelievable for me to recognize that a week from today, next Monday, is Labor Day. And I'm guessing right now, just since I do mention the fact that it is Labor Day, I'm anticipating that we will be doing a program on that day. We usually do on holidays that fall on Monday. But I'll just hold that in the air if something happens, or maybe the folks at Head On Radio Network who are unable to produce the program that day or whatever. We'll wait and see. But right now, I'm fully anticipating that we will be with you next Monday, a week from today. We do look for and solicit your participation in our program. I hope that you will feel comfortable to join us, to come on the air and share your thoughts, your concerns, your ideas, your perspectives with us. The mere fact that you are a listener to this program, to the Head On Radio Network and its other programs, indicates that when you have something to say that really warrants picking up the phone and making the call, it's probably something that all of us ought to hear and will appreciate hearing. I hope you will recognize that, and that you will not hesitate for a moment to share your thoughts and your ideas with our other listeners as well as with me. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. And of course, 4676 translates into Horn, H-O-R-N, if you remember the number easier that way. 304 363 Horn, H-O-R-N, will work. If you'd like to communicate with me directly in an email, I would appreciate hearing from you that way. I know in some cases it would be an alternative to coming on the air because people, for understandable reasons, may be reluctant to go on the air, although over the years, as I've been listening off and on to Bob Kincaid's program in the evenings, it doesn't sound to me like there are too many regular listeners of the Horn who are uncomfortable about getting on the air. But be that as it may, I know that there are some people out there that may have things to say, and they're a little bit uncertain whether they're comfortable getting on the air and taking up space or directing all of the attention to them even for a brief period. And if that's you, I understand that. And if you'd like to send me an email and share your thoughts with me that way, I'd be glad to do the very best I can to get your ideas on the air as you intended them, as you directed them to me. My email address is waobrien906 @gmail.com. That's waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N 906 @gmail.com. And finally, I direct your attention to our Facebook page. If you are a regular user of Facebook, and many people are, I mentioned last week, kind of tongue-in-cheek, that I was a little bit stunned one day last week at the end of my class when one of my students came up and made it known that she's not a user of Facebook. And I was surprised, but at the same time, I was a little bit encouraged by that, to be honest with you. I've had thoughts about Facebook myself, because very honestly, there are some things on there that I don't appreciate reading either. But I also am appreciative of the fact that Facebook, in many cases, can become almost addictive to a lot of people, and I find myself at times falling into that trap as well. But if you are a regular user of Facebook and you know how easy it is, just go to the main homepage, facebook.com, and at the top there is a search box. And if you type in the search box, the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will be onto our Facebook page. And as I've mentioned over the last couple of weeks, now that we've begun this semester and I'm teaching a history class, I'm putting some materials directly related to the class I'm teaching on our Facebook page. And I'm identifying them by labeling them as WVU Tech History 152. And if you see that, you will know that that particular posting is directed specifically to the students in this class. It is not reserved exclusively for them, however. And this morning, I put an item on Facebook, on the Facebook page, which is the quite famous speech, and I know we've covered it a couple of times over the months and years here at the Virtual Center. The speech delivered by John Winthrop, Governor John Winthrop, in leading the settlers from England to Massachusetts Bay in 1630. And on the Arbella, Winthrop gave this famous speech, which is usually referred to as the City Upon a Hill speech. And I've put that on the Facebook page with a designation for these students in this class. And I told them this morning in class that on Wednesday we would be covering this document in some depth. And for those of you who might have already looked at it, let me mention this and explain it. And for those of you who haven't looked at it, you might want to, because the document itself is 1 page long. But to that, I added a second posting on Facebook, which asks some specific analytical questions about that document. And I alerted the students in my class to those questions today. I encourage them to read the document first and struggle with the meaning of the document as it makes the most sense to them, and then to look at the questions and the various insights, if you will, things that they might look for in the document as ways to gain entry to it. And of course, what I'm suggesting is that the use of primary sources like this document are very, very rich in the understanding and the depth that they promise those who read them and address them with the right questions in mind. Basically, what I'm suggesting is that certain of these documents, and this is one, are so rich in what they offer the reader that it's possible to dwell on them intently and actually drag meaning out of the documents that's not clearly there on first glance or first reading. But as you read it more carefully and you start to ask questions of what's there, you can gain entry at various points through the document and begin to see things that might not have been so obvious on the first reading. This document is one of those documents, I believe. And I have alerted my class that I'm giving them what I call a document assignment. I used to call it a DBQ, document-based question, as part of their graded materials. And I told them this morning that the Wednesday after Labor Day, a week from this coming Wednesday, I would be giving them their first take-home assignment on a document that they would be asked to analyze and to submit a paper on a couple of classes after that. And so basically this particular document is one that I want to spend a lot of time on in class on Wednesday, because not only do I want to reveal what I think are some of the most interesting things content-wise that are in the document, but I also want to give students in the class the opportunity to actually experience the process of analyzing a document, of essentially tearing into it and to discovering meaning in the document that's not there on first reading, but on a more careful critical reading of the document becomes very, very rewarding information for those who read it. So that document is on the Facebook page if you'd like to look at it. I might also mention that I put a posting on our Facebook page, I believe yesterday, that made specific reference to an article that was in Sunday's New York Times by one of the regular columnists of the Times, Nicholas Kristof. I thought it was a pretty revealing, pretty informative piece that Kristof wrote. Basically, the theme, the article, was about the Roman Emperor Caligula. And Kristof was sharing some of the key insights and information about Rome under the rule of Caligula and some specific details on what Caligula's reign was like. And of course, while the article was about Caligula, in reality, it seemed appropriate if we consider somebody else other than the reign of Caligula, because there's so many similarities between the things that happened under this particular reign and some of the things that are happening now under the reign of the current holder of power within the presidency of the United States, that I think the similarities are striking and disturbing, to be quite honest. I thought it was a very, very informative article, one well worth reading. So I put a posting on the Facebook page, quoted a line or two from it, but basically left it up to the reader to draw whatever conclusions from it that particular reader might choose to draw. But anyway, that's a posting that I put on the Facebook page, on our Facebook page yesterday as well. What I'd like to do at the beginning of our program today, as kind of the first issue, I'd like to return to an issue that we were dealing with in one of our programs toward the end of our time together last week. And specifically, it deals with the Confederate monuments and the controversies surrounding decisions being made in many areas of the country about taking down these monuments. Obviously, the situation that is underway in Texas right now is pretty well dwarfing all the other news. But the fact of the matter is this particular issue was receiving quite a bit of attention throughout up until the end of last week, up until issues related to Hurricane Harvey began to push everything else, it seemed, off the front pages of our newspapers and the headlines in our internet offerings. But the fact of the matter is it's still significant. Here in southern West Virginia, our Sunday paper included yesterday an article on this very topic that was submitted to the paper, and it raised the issue. And it was a very well thought out article. It was local. The author was from this area. And the author was more than willing to give credit to those people, and I guess I consider myself among that group, those people, who believe that the monuments ought to come down because of the nature of the message they sent to too many of our citizens. And this particular author acknowledged the realities of that and admitted a concern about that. But at the same time, his argument was that there's a difference between his feeling was that there was a substantial difference between the Confederate flag and these monuments. And he was much more comfortable with taking down the Confederate flag because of what it symbolized than he was taking down the monuments. Because his concern was that the monuments didn't exactly say the same thing as the flag. The message of the two, he felt, was substantially different enough to warrant taking down the flag, but not necessarily the monuments. His feeling was that the monuments indeed gave credit to the military exploits of some very prominent, committed people who fought for the South and died, in many cases, for the South. And his argument is that their contributions and their sincerity should be recognized and should not be lost to history because of other issues or other concerns. And so what the existence of that article in our local paper yesterday the message it sent to me was, this particular issue really warrants continued attention because it's very, very important. This is a kind of an aside, but in our class this morning, we were talking about the early days of Jamestown, the Jamestown colony in the early 17th century in Virginia. More specifically, the subject came up of African slaves being brought into the Chesapeake in order to provide the labor for an emerging tobacco culture that was beginning to take off early in the 17th century in Virginia and then Maryland, when Maryland was founded a few years later. Maryland was able to avoid the initial problems that Jamestown had experienced because those who settled Maryland very quickly went right into tobacco production. And of course, tobacco was a cash crop. Tobacco was the leading form, at least at the beginning of Britain's colonial experience, of the pursuit of wealth that the establishment of colonies was all about. And I, this morning in class, made it clear that for many people, there were other initiatives associated with colonization, the spreading of the gospel, the word of God, to those people that didn't have it and all of these other things. And so the big debate about those is to what extent they are reasons for colonization and to what extent they might actually become justifications for colonization. There's absolutely no question, however, that the very nature of the establishment of the Virginia Jamestown colony by the Virginia Company was profit-driven. The Virginia Company was a joint stock company. The money that it raised came from investors who were risking their investment in the exploits of the company in expectations of profit. And so therefore, by becoming investors in the company, they owned stock and benefited from the success of the company. And that's really the way that resources were raised for the establishment of the initial colonial venture in Jamestown. So whatever came later about missionaries coming and bringing the word of God to the Native Americans, in the eyes of some people, obviously justified the colonial experience. But the fact of the matter is, in some cases, it was more rationalization than anything else, because it may in part have covered up the pursuit of wealth, but it didn't replace it. It didn't displace the pursuit of wealth as the principal objective of the colonial experience. The point I'm making, the point I was making this morning, is that with the the emergence of a tobacco culture and the need for labor, the company began to experiment with various ways to solicit, encourage, recruit people in England who were willing to relocate to the New World. And the one thing that relocating to the New World had to offer was land. And the company began to introduce a number of innovations, if you will, lures, benefits to such relocation. One of them was the headright system. Another one was the indentured servant system. And a third, of course, was the slave system. All of these were intended to recruit settlers who were willing to come to the New World. The headright system offered 50 acres of land to anyone who would relocate. Those who owned land in the New World could engage in contract labor and bring others over here under the indentured servant system. And that would make an additional headright of 50 acres available to the owner, to the initial owner of the enterprise. In other words, the owner of a plantation, of a tobacco plantation, could expand the size of the plantation by being awarded a headright of an additional 50 acres for every laborer brought to the New World. And if the laborer came to the New World under contract labor responsibilities, the so-called indentured servant system, then that particular person who couldn't afford the trip over himself would agree to a contract which would require that he work for the company or for that particular planter for a certain number of years, usually somewhere between 4 and 7. And at the end of the contract period, the indentured servant system, the indentured servant, would be granted a headright. The supervisor or the owner of the plantation had already gotten a headright for that, and the contract laborer would become a landowner. In other words, the indentured servant system was an investment in future opportunity. It was an introduction, in other words, of the elements of capitalism into the New World, almost from the very beginning. In 1619, the first boat, the first ship carrying slaves from Africa arrived in Jamestown. And I was sharing with the class this morning that if you look at the Virginia laws through the period, it's very, very interesting, the introduction of slave labor into the Chesapeake. First of all, you had to have a form of agriculture that demanded, that was labor intensive, and that was the harvesting of tobacco. It required labor, lots of labor. And with the introduction of African slaves, these labor needs could be addressed. But for several years, the indentured servant system continued to dominate the labor system in colonial Virginia. It was only very gradually that the balance between indentured servants on the one hand and African slaves on the other began to waver in favor of African slaves. Part of the reason was that the lure of relocation under the indentured servant system to Virginia began to weaken as the best lands were already controlled by somebody else. In other words, as the 17th century went on, there are numerous reports of indentured servant systems, indentured servants becoming very upset because the head rights they were being granted was for land that was considered to be rather worthless. It wasn't conducive to tobacco production, and tobacco production was the big money maker in the region. That's what people wanted to produce, was tobacco, because it sold as much as you could grow, sold in Europe. But increasingly, the best lands were gone, and indentured servants found that they were getting land that was less than attractive. And gradually, the indentured servant system began to dissipate in that region. But the demands for labor didn't. And so gradually, the number of slaves began to increase precipitously, while the number of indentured servants began to decline. And you can see all of this reflected in the laws of Virginia. At first, there was no such thing as slavery. The institution of slavery in the New World didn't exist. According to the law, slave labor was merely another form of indentured servitude. There was no difference early on between a traditional indentured servant contract and the introduction of slave labor into the Chesapeake. But gradually, as the 17th century wore on, the laws began to reflect a longer period of indenture for African slaves, but they weren't considered slaves yet, for Africans than for whites. The laws began to reflect a serious note of race. It became very clear that the race of Africans was condemning them to a longer period of indenture than whites were required to sign on for. And then eventually, well into the 17th century, the labor contract for Africans became permanent. Their period of indenture never ended. They never received any longer their head right. And there we have the beginnings of a slave system. And from that point on, the law begins to reflect the ingredients of an evolving slave system directed principally at African imports. The point is, from very, very early on in colonial history, the nation finds itself in a racial situation, finds itself challenged by the realities of race. And the creation, the evolution of the slave system is society's way to deal with that racial reality. It obviously was inadequate. In the long term, it leads to civil war. Throughout the history of the United States, as it's evolving, the slave issue is kind of the major thing behind the scenes that seems to affect everything that happens in politics. the race issue becomes an issue in American history from the very beginning that seems to be one that nobody can find a way to solve. The Civil War indicates that we had failed to solve it. The racial situation in today's world indicates as well that we continue to be challenged by a racial situation that we have yet to solve. So I think this story is incredibly important. And that's the story that I tried to share with students this morning. And the more I got into it, the more I began to realize how significant it is, and that it probably ought to deserve some attention here on our program this afternoon. So given that, and given an unsolved racial issue, it seems to me we really aren't done with the matter of the Civil War monuments and what they reflect. I mentioned last week when we dealt with this that there were a number of very, very insightful pieces available online on this particular issue. You can get very, very well-argued positions on all sides of this issue. It's a challenging enough, controversial enough issue that the solutions to it aren't clear. It's very muddy, very blurry, and remains that way. I mentioned last week that what used to be a good friend of mine, I still communicate with him on Facebook, is the editor of a digital publication online, which I encourage all of you to look at. It's called FlaglerLive.com. And the editor of Flagler Live is Pierre Tristram, Tristam. Pierre Tristram was a newspaper reporter here many years ago in the 1990s, in southern West Virginia. And he and I became pretty good friends when I first located here. He was a young reporter, and many of us, I include myself, were taken with how good he was, how insightful he was, how well written and well argued his op-eds were. It was very clear that he probably would be ultimately recruited away from here because he was that talented. But it was also clear to some of us, and this includes specifically me, that he was saying some things in what he was writing that were unpopular in this area. And a number of us who were really fond of him were concerned that he was writing himself into some serious challenges. He was irritating a lot of influential people in the area. But to his credit, it didn't stop him. Eventually he relocated, and I had really for a number of years never knew where he had gone until I somehow came across the Flagler Live and saw the fact that he is editor. This was about 6 or 7 years ago. And since that time, he and I have reconnected on Facebook. And I regularly read his pieces, his editorials, because they are so good, so insightful. Anyway, on the 19th of August, on a posting dated August 19th, Pierre Tristram on Flagler Live has a piece on the Confederate monuments issue. The title of his essay is Confederate Monuments Phony History. And I think that gives you some insight as to the positions that he's taken. on this matter. The reason I raise this here is because this particular piece is one in which he chooses to print reactions from his readers on both sides of the issue. The result is that the article itself becomes what I believe is an extremely valuable collection of well-written position papers on various sides of this issue. And I thought, before we basically put this issue to rest for a time here at the Virtual Center, it might be good to share with you some of the substance of what Pierre Tristram's pieces have elicited. In the region, a regular reader of Flagler Live is an obvious acquaintance of Pierre's named Colleen Conklin, who he identifies as a local school board member. And he points out that on her Facebook page, Colleen Conklin took a fairly pointed position on the Confederate monument issue. And he quotes the position she took, and here it is. Quote, "I can't contain myself," she wrote. "I'm sure I'll regret this post, but I can't stand it anymore. You can't erase history. You can't. Attempting to do so is questionable," she says. "The history they represent may not be appropriate, but it's still part of our history. Discuss it, share it, debate it, but you can't erase it. Forcing the removal of these statues is doing nothing but feeding the hate," unquote. Pierre obviously is on the other side of the position that Colleen Conklin takes. He says straight up, "I happen to disagree with Conklin's take on the monuments." And then he says, "It reflects a simplistic understanding of the issue that conflates all statues, all monuments with all histories, as if the monuments themselves don't have their own ideological language and history separate from the history they claim to represent, which Confederate memorials very much do. That's why they were put up. Conklin's take assumes that all monuments were created equal by virtue of having been created, as if not catching the irony. We're talking about monuments to men who fought a war in the name of inequality and racial supremacy," Pierre says. And she buys into the claim that history is being erased by dint of removing these monstrosities from public grounds, which, Pierre says, is as ridiculous as claiming that the history of the Holocaust is being partially erased by not having Himmler, Hitler, and Goebbels riding 3 magnificent horses or tinkering with ovens in a superb carving on, say, Stone Mountain, Georgia. And that's Pierre's response to Colleen Conklin. But then Pierre goes on to include reactions of other people. I marked a number of these as pieces that I really thought our listeners here at the Virtual Center might benefit from hearing. So with that, let me go on. Because Pierre does say that it is encouraging that debate happens and that the responses to Colleen Conklin trigger that debate, and that this is positive. But then he says, debating alone is not the only virtue either. There's a point where agreeing to disagree, that mantra of the coward, becomes a complicit endorsement of the inadmissible. It's okay to disagree on whether the Civil War was necessary or not, whether Robert E. Lee was a traitor or an honorable general, even whether secession was a right endorsed by the framers or not. And Pierre comments in parentheses, it was. Or whether Lincoln repeatedly violated the Constitution in order to enforce the Union, which he did. I don't think Pierre says it's okay to disagree about the fact that the South fought to preserve genocidal centuries of oppression and degradation and subsequently resurrected the oppression under Jim Crow. If we disagree over basic facts, we're not debating history but rewriting it. Not only rewriting history, but collaborating in the erasure of the humanity of an entire people. We are re-brutalizing Dred Scott's descendants and re-endorsing the objectification of a people as only 3/5 the worth of a human being. We're just doing it in the shadow of these monuments. That's pretty powerful stuff, I believe. And that's why I wanted to share it with you. Pierre then includes some examples of reactions to Colleen Conklin's piece. Here's one from a reader of Flagler Live named Nancy Nally. He names the authors of these pieces. Quote, normally I would agree with you about preserving artifacts of racism. We need to see Sally Hemings' quarters preserved at Monticello, as well as the other slave quarters. We need to see the concentration camps preserved so we don't forget. But these statues weren't erected as memorials. They were erected solely to serve as a bludgeon on an oppressed people. That bludgeoning is not part of history. It's ongoing. That's why we can't preserve the statues as history, because they aren't history, but rather an ongoing offense, unquote. That's Nancy Nally's position. Here's a reaction from a reader, Christine Barwick. Quote, I agree with you, Colleen. I think the point is that the inscription on the statue in Durham says, dedicated to the boys who wore gray, unquote. We have to remember that the soldiers who fought in the South were following the orders of their commanders, just like their own brothers in the North. They died just like their brothers in the North died. Whether they believed in the cause, whether the cause was right or wrong, is not relevant. They followed orders and they died. The statue is in honor of them. Why shouldn't they be honored? They died serving their country, which is part of our history. We cannot change our history, unquote. That's a pretty powerful argument on the other side, is it not? I thought it was. Here's a reaction from Scott Spradley. Quote, to me, the distinction is that a monument, statue, is placed in the public domain to honor its subject. A museum is a place to preserve history, good or bad. As a Southerner from North Carolina, I have never understood or agreed with many of my friends and even family that Confederate artifacts belong in a place of honor instead of a place destined to preserve history. The South will rise again mentality has totally escaped me, despite my efforts to understand it. So I fall on the side of supporting the peaceful moving of the artifacts from the places of honor they occupy to a museum or the graveyard or other place more suitable to preserve this sad chapter in our country's history. Unquote. John Hardison writes the following. How would you feel if you were raped? Awful, right? How would you feel if your rapist got a park named after him? How would you feel if your rapist got a park named after him because he raped you? Now, how would you feel if your rapist also got a very dignified looking statue erected in that park because he raped you? Now walk through that park and look at that statue every day, knowing that your kids and their kids will look up at your rapist twice a day for the rest of their lives. There's a difference between remembering and celebrating. If we need to remember that badly, we should seriously consider renaming Palm Coast Parkway, Hitler Boulevard. We certainly need to remember that right now, no? I mean, it's not like he was my oppressor, so what difference would it make to me? Ask yourself how you might feel about your kids playing in Hitler Park under a grand statue of a man that killed millions of people, particularly if you're one of the people he'd have wanted dead. These monuments celebrate those that fought for slavery. They celebrate the murder of tens of millions of people. The sons and daughters of the Confederacy have fought a good fight for a long time. But the days of black children playing in parks and walking avenues named for men that saw them as dogs, that's over with. That's done. It never should have happened. As to this being our country, we need to stop doing that. No, it's their history. We are the United States of America. Our history is not their history. We literally went to war to make sure there would never be our history. On Southern pride. There are all kinds of things to be proud of. Always. If you can't separate your Southern pride from your slavery or love of those who sought to keep the right to own people, you have a very serious problem. But it's a personal problem. Take as much time as you like to work it out. The rest of us need to move on. Unquote. That's an incredible piece when you think about it. Imagine if you've been raped. Imagine if you had a park named after you because you were raped and had a statue erected in that park for the very same reason. Here's one more, and then I'll stop. This is from someone named P.T. Thomas. The Civil War was the most divisive time in America's history. After the war, the wounds ran deep, especially with the way the South was ransacked by carpetbaggers. Part of the healing process was the installation of monuments honoring war heroes on both sides. No, this was not like erecting statues honoring the likes of Hitler. These were, by any definition of the term, Americans. This was a war where Americans fought Americans, family against family, friend against friend. It just seems ironic that these monuments are now causing division where they once brought unity. Personally, I think a lot of these feelings of being offended are manufactured and then spoon-fed to the public. Creating division is a specialty of the socialists, unquote. I'm not done. It's the only way they can gain power, and so many voters are eager consumers of propaganda. If you want to remember our history, if you want to use it as a teachable moment, then you should erect accurate symbols of the time and the reason why 600,000 Americans died. I just think that these contributions by Pierre Tristram in response to his initial piece, which is based on the position of Colleen Conklin in the Florida area, gives us a really good, balanced view of the different sides of this issue. But the fact of the matter is, balanced views are fine in literature. I guess what I'm saying is I believe, and I know Pierre Tristram believes as well, that balance is not the key factor here. Reality is. And the reality is that these monuments are causing damage to certain people in our society. And as such, they need to be moved somewhere else, whether it be in a museum or whatever. I believe that. I think he does as well. But I think the issue is serious enough that all of us need to think about it and reflect upon it. It's an important issue. It didn't come up for no reason. It came up and has persisted for as long as it has, because the subject raises serious questions about our society and the level or degree of our commitment to the principles we say that America is all about. It seems to me if we are definitely really committed to those values and those principles and those ideals, then it almost requires us to be on the side of those who would take down those monuments. They may not speak to you and me in a personal way, but the fact that they speak very personally to some of our countrymen, fellow countrymen, our neighbors, means that in the interests of good citizenship and brotherhood, I think we need to take the appropriate action. And I think it's happening. And at the same time, I really understand the position of these other people. I'm a historian. I respect the value of history as much as anybody else. But I'm struck by one of those contributions which raised the issue of a park or a statue in a park dedicated to Hitler and Goebbels or whatever, because they contributed to the making of history. If you look at the article by Nick Kristof that was in the Times yesterday on Caligula, the last thing I would want to see is a statue erected to Caligula because he was a Roman emperor. I think Caligula needs to be remembered, but not in our public parks, not in our public places. Because the fact of the matter is, in his own time, Caligula would have had no respect for the very public that such a statue of him would offend. With that, I think we've reached the top of the hour and the end of our first hour in today's program. In our second hour, after we pause for a 5-minute break, I'd like to get back to the sanity of the 18th century, if I could. In response to issues that we dealt with and covered here last week in the Virtual Center, I've been spending a good bit of my time over the last 3 or 4 days, over this past weekend, doing some research on ratification of the Constitution related specifically to some of the issues we raised here at the Virtual Center. More specifically, the notes of a New York delegate named Robert Yates. His notes from the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. I'd like to share with you some of the things that I think I've been able to pick up over the last few days on this particular issue. I think it's very relevant, and I think it speaks to what I think is a significant issue. And I've pretty well decided that if I can find my way clear to do it, I'd like to sit down and put a little something together for publication on this particular issue. Because I think it speaks to the issue of values and principles. And unfortunately, I think we're living in a period where values and principles don't seem to be the priorities they ought to be. And so anything that we can do to stimulate respect and support for values and principles, I think it might be well taken for us to do that. And so I'd like to do it. But first, let's pause and take a 5-minute break. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to take our 5-minute break. It's about 2 or 3 minutes beyond the top of the hour. We'll pause for 4 or 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll continue with our second hour here at the Virtual Center. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Thank you, Agnes. What a pleasant surprise at the middle of our program between our first and second hour to hear from Agnes. Welcome. I hope everything is good with you, and thank you. You are listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. On this Monday, we're in the beginning of our second hour on this Monday, the 28th day of August in the year 2017. We do invite you to participate actively in our program by picking up the phone and using the direct line that we have available to you to get you on the air and give you the opportunity to share your thoughts, not only with me, but with our listeners. The phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you'd like to communicate with me in an email, I would be honored to hear from you that way. My email address is WAObrien, OBRIEN 906 @gmail.com. That's WAObrien 906 @gmail.com. And then, of course, there is our Facebook page. And if you go to Facebook and in the search box type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will be onto our Facebook page, and you can look at some of the more recent postings there. And I think there are a couple related to this program, and there are a couple related to the class I'm teaching as well. And I think all of them you might find interesting. If you were with us at the very beginning of the program, I spent a little bit of time at the beginning talking about one of the postings on the John Winthrop letter on the City on a Hill that was just posted this morning for those students, and encourage others of you to take a look at that if you hadn't seen it. It's a pretty powerful document, I believe. In the second hour, as I promised at the conclusion of our first hour, I'd like to return to the 18th century, and more specifically to a topic that we were dealing with, I believe, last Wednesday, and it links to some of the issues that I've been dealing with in my own research and in my writing. And based on that program, on some of the things we looked at, I've been driven over the last 3 or 4 days to do some pretty intensive research into the ratification of the Constitution, more specifically in the state of New York. And let me be honest with you, my research on the Constitution has really not led me to spend much time in the New York Ratification Convention. I've read about it. I'm familiar with some of the key issues that came up in New York. I'm well aware that New York was the last of the major states to ratify the Constitution. In effect, the Constitution already had become the law of the land with the ratification in June of 1788. First, New Hampshire. That was the 9th state. And then Virginia was the 10th state. And there's no question that if some people believe that whereas the 9th state was New Hampshire wasn't a significant enough state in the Union to give Federalists comfort. In other words, the fact that they had met the minimal demands of getting 9 states to ratify didn't necessarily bode well for supporters of the Constitution if 2 of the states that had not yet ratified were Virginia and New York, 2 of the largest states. Virginia was the largest state. It was only when Virginia ratified in late June of 1788 that supporters of the Constitution felt that they could breathe a sigh of relief, as it were. Because with the addition of Virginia to the to the 9 other states that had ratified, making a total of 10, Federalists were able to feel much more confident that the Constitution could indeed go into effect without too much serious opposition. The fact that some of the major states, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and now Virginia, had ratified, actually bode well for the success of the Constitution. It did something else. It created tremendous pressure on New York to ratify. Because the fact of the matter is, Virginia ratification happened, and in fact, New Hampshire ratification happened as well as Virginia's, while the New York ratifying convention was in session. And there's absolutely no question that when word of first New Hampshire and then of Virginia reached New York, and it came directly to Alexander Hamilton, who was leading the forces for ratification in the New York Ratification Convention, that mere fact created tremendous pressure on the state of New York to ratify. And in fact, one of the things that becomes very obvious as you read the minutes, the debates of the New York Ratifying Convention, is that the convention and those in attendance made very obvious mention of the fact that ratification almost became required with the ratification especially of Virginia. The concern was that if the New York Convention didn't ratify, that would mean that New York would be left out of the Union. And that, in effect, would have serious implications for New York and for the people who live there. For example, the Treaty of Peace at the end of the American Revolution. Because ratification of the Constitution meant ratification and approval of the treaties that were existent under the Articles of Confederation. That meant that ratification of the Constitution, in effect, meant that the new constitutional government also re-ratified the Treaty of Peace of 1783. There was serious concern at the New York Convention that if New York was left out of the Union, that would throw open the issue of the peace treaty as it affected New Yorkers. So consequently, many people believed that the ratification in June of first New Hampshire and then Massachusetts made it absolutely essential that New York find a way to ratify. Let me share with you a couple of details which make that issue a little bit more significant than it sounds. I've made a number of notes here. When delegates were elected to the New York Ratifying Convention, which was due to open in June, late June, 1788, Anti-Federalists won the majority of the seats in the New York Ratifying Convention. The majority of the people elected in New York were committed to voting down the Constitution of the United States. And it wasn't really close. The results were 46 anti-Federalists versus 19 Federalists. So in a sense, the anti-Federalists had better than a 2-to-1 majority in the New York Ratifying Convention. Consequently, what impact did that have on the strategy of Federalists? And of course, the leading Federalist in New York was Alexander Hamilton. It is no accident that the Federalist Papers that began to appear in late 1787 under the name Publius were written principally by Alexander Hamilton. Most of the 85 papers were written by him. John Jay wrote the first 5. In fact, one of the things that becomes clear as you read the minutes of the New York Ratifying Convention is that John Jay's contributions to the Federalist Papers, which are at the very beginning of the process, tend to be viewed as the least significant of the Federalist Papers. Madison's contributions, even though there's so many less than Hamilton wrote, are considered to be the principal documents in the Federalist series because they address the issues of representation and how the Constitution is designed to work, and also the reality that James Madison himself was the author of the Virginia Plan, which was the basic skeletal outline of the Constitution that was finally ratified. So in effect, Madison authored the Constitution of the United States. So therefore, his papers on how it was intended to work are very significant papers. Last week, we were looking at the issue of representation, at the issue of the nature of the republic under the Constitution, in ways that the definition of Republican government changed under the Constitution of the United States. And we addressed specifically James Madison's determination to insist that even though the Constitution of the United States was to replace the Articles of Confederation, and even though the Articles of Confederation was modeled on the ideals of republicanism as explained and supported by Montesquieu in his Spirit of the Laws, Madison continued to insist throughout that the principles of Republican government were retained under the Constitution. And Madison said in Federalist number 39 that if anybody could prove to him that the Constitution of the United States violated the principles of Republican government, he would be the first one to admit that the Constitution ought not to be ratified. In other words, he was insistent that the Constitution of the United States was faithful to the values and the principles of republicanism. We talked about that. But we also talked about the fact that many of the delegates elected to Philadelphia for purposes of revising the Articles of Confederation were not prepared for the total scrapping of the Articles and all that went with it. The vote to hold the deliberations at Philadelphia in secret. The determination to the principle that whatever is said in the convention hall stays in the convention hall. That the members of the convention took a vote to honor the secrecy of the debates. The fact that the Confederation, the Articles of Confederation, was to be replaced by the new document introduced called the Virginia Plan, which was Madison's plan. And that becomes the basis of discussion and debate throughout the summer of 1787. And with the amendments and the changes made to it, the Virginia Plan amended becomes the Constitution of the United States that is ratified by the appropriate number of states by the summer, by the end of June of 1788. The fact of the matter is, most of what we know about the Constitutional Convention of 1787 comes principally from the copious notes maintained by James Madison. He was there every day. He took notes of who spoke and what they said on every single day. Madison leaves to us the most detailed account of the Constitutional Convention we have. But the fact of the matter is they aren't the only set of minutes of the convention that were kept. Pinckney of South Carolina keeps notes as well. His notes have been lost. Part of the reason he kept notes is because Pinckney made a specific proposal for a Constitution of the United States that in many ways was very close to Madison's. The fact that Pinckney's plan has been lost to history, some people attribute to Madison, who wanted to bury Pinckney's contribution in order to continue most of the attention focusing on his plan. Some people believe that. I don't know. But the fact of the matter is, one of the sets of minutes was taken by Robert Yates, anti-federalist delegate from the state of New York. Robert Yates was a judge on the New York Supreme Court. He was a jurist, a legalist, a judge. I think in the additional reading that I've done, I think that becomes very significant. I think that Robert Yates, as a member of the judiciary, believes that he is operating under guidelines which are more stringent and more restrictive than the others. I really believe, from what I've read, that Yates's position as a judge on the Supreme Court may be the principal factor in his decision to not release his notes, to not make his notes public. Yates was an avowed opponent of the Constitution of the United States. He arrived at the convention near the beginning of the convention, right at the end of May, along with John Lansing, the other anti-federalist delegate from New York. Yates and Lansing both left the convention on the 10th of July and never returned to Philadelphia for the rest of the convention again. Instead, they co-authored a letter to their governor, George Clinton, who was an anti-federalist governor of New York. And in that letter, which they both signed, they explained to Clinton, Governor Clinton, why they were leaving the convention, why they believed that the convention was overstepping its bounds. They believed that they have been elected by the voters of New York to represent them at the Constitutional Convention to debate revision of the Articles of Confederation. They believed that scrapping the Articles of Confederation in favor of a totally new government was beyond their charge. It was asking them to participate in something they didn't feel they had the right to do. Plus the fact they were very opposed to the new Constitution as it was being introduced and discussed in Philadelphia. They were elected as anti-federalists. They were elected as supporters of the Articles of Confederation. They were elected as supporters of the Articles who recognized that amendments were necessary. But they were not elected to scrap the Articles. And their position to the governor was that when they realized that that's what they were being asked to do, and after the debates indicated what was really happening in Philadelphia, the two of them made the decision that they had to leave. No sooner did they leave the convention than Robert Yates, judge on the New York Supreme Court, began to write in the newspapers a series of articles under the pseudonym Brutus, in which he attacked the Constitution of the United States as it was being developed in Philadelphia, and continued to attack the Constitution once the convention adjourned in September and the final product was available for everybody to see as it was printed in the newspapers. The Constitution of the United States, as drafted, was published in all of America's newspapers. And in a series of articles under the name Brutus, Robert Yates penned article after article. I believe there were a total of 12 Brutus letters criticizing various aspects of the Constitution of the United States, criticizing the right of the Constitutional Convention itself to even create a new government, when in fact they were sent to Philadelphia to revise the Articles. One of the things that Robert Yates took issue with was the decision at the very beginning of the convention that the proceedings would be secret. He opposed it. He didn't feel it was right. He didn't feel it was conducive to the principles he believed in as far as Republican government are concerned, because he believed the people had a right to know what was going on and should not be kept in the dark. But at the same time, he took that oath of secrecy. Consequently, he refused throughout the debates, throughout the ratification convention in New York, he refused to release his notes because he believed that he had taken an oath not to do that, and that to release his minutes or his notes would violate his principles, and he wouldn't do it, even though he was heavily invested in opposition to the Constitution of the United States. I believe, and this is just my own feeling, I believe that his role as judge of the Supreme Court contributed to that decision. I believe that he believed that as a judge, it would be particularly bad for him to violate an oath, even if such violation was to achieve an objective that he felt was worthy. The more I've read in recent days the more convinced I've become that this is an example of principle tested. Throughout my career in studying this issue, I've speculated, like many people who focus on this period have, as to what might have happened, what the nation might have been like if the Constitution of the United States had not passed. More specifically, could the Articles of Confederation have been ratified successfully to the point that it actually worked? Could we have remained a nation of free sovereign states, joined together in a league of friendship for mutual benefit, where people's individual rights were protected on the local level by their own state governments, where there was no Supreme Court, where there was no National Bill of Rights, that individual rights were protected at the state level, not on the national level? Would it have been possible to make the changes that made it possible for the Articles of Confederation to work? That question has haunted me for a number of years. I can remember my good friend from Madison, John Kaminsky, who edited the ratification papers, probably the most knowledgeable person on ratification of the Constitution alive today. John believed that the Articles of Confederation were not beyond revision. He believed that the Articles of Confederation could have been made to work. He believed that the reason Federalists were determined to replace the Articles was because he believed that major supporters of the Constitution of the United States didn't want the Articles of Confederation to work. They wanted the new government for a variety of reasons. I think we know to a large degree what many of those reasons are. It's very revealing to read the minutes of the New York Ratifying Convention. It's very revealing because the supporters of the Constitution are in such a distinct minority. So the only question left is what kind of strategy would they adopt? What is their strategy going into a convention where they are outnumbered better than 2-1? That among their opponents happened to be the governor of the state, and that the majority of the state is committed to turning down or voting against the handiwork of the framers in Philadelphia. One of the things that is very, very revealing in these debates is that New York City is so strongly in favor of the Constitution that there's serious talk in the convention that if the convention votes against the Constitution, New York City might be forced to secede from the state of New York. That in a sense, the state of New York might end up to be divided between the southern part of the state, dominated by New York City, and the rest of the state, with cities like Buffalo and Schenectady and Syracuse and Poughkeepsie, and of course, Albany, which later becomes the state capital. It so happens that one of the anti-federalist delegates from New York, John Lansing, is mayor of Albany. Robert Yates is on the Supreme Court. They are leading opponents of ratification. Alexander Hamilton, of course, is based principally in New York City. That's where the merchants and the bankers and the investors who support ratification are located. There's serious concern at the convention that if the anti-federalists follow through with their better than 2-to-1 majority and vote down the Constitution, that New York City and the regions around it will separate from the state of New York. Under those conditions, what possibly can be the strategy of the Constitution supporters, of the Federalists, of Alexander Hamilton, Livingston, John Jay, and the rest? There's no question from reading the debates that the principal Federalist strategy is delay. Federalists really believe that their cause will be strengthened if they can hold off a final vote in the convention until New Hampshire and Virginia make the decision. Alexander Hamilton, in fact, sends word to Madison that the minute Virginia makes its decision in Richmond on the court's Constitution, Madison needs to make sure that those in the New York Convention find out about it right away. Hamilton wants to know. He realizes that if New Hampshire ratifies, and then if Virginia ratifies, the pressure on New York to ratify is going to be enhanced significantly. If New Hampshire and Virginia, especially Virginia, vote down the Constitution, then that probably will mean defeat in New York as well. So the result is that the Federalists in New York make it their strategy to delay. And what they do is they are successful in getting a motion passed at the beginning of the convention to debate the Constitution clause by clause, paragraph by paragraph, as long as that takes, in order that the delegates will be very, very familiar with what's in the Constitution before they've cast a final ballot on it. That strategy plays directly into the hands of the Federalists, into the hands of Hamilton and Livingston and John Jay and the rest of them. And that becomes the debate in the New York Ratifying Convention. But let me tell you what else I found in reading the minutes of the New York Ratifying Convention. Even though Robert Yates, Supreme Court judge, writes 12 Brutus essays urging opposition to the Constitution, from the time they leave the convention all the way up through the elections for the ratifying convention in January, these Brutus essays are being published in the New York newspapers. And Yates is taking an active role in opposing ratification of the Constitution in New York. He's urging the election of opponents, not Federalists. And he's obviously successful. In other words, one of the most interesting factors here is that Hamilton and later on Madison are writing the Federalist Papers in support of ratification of the Constitution from late 1787 on. The Constitutional Convention adjourns on the 17th of September. The first few Federalist Papers come out early in October. They're written at first by John Jay. And John Jay's principal theme is to preserve the Union and not give in to the tendency to split the Union into a series of regions, which is what many opponents of the Constitution want to do. In order to give full faith to Montesquieu and the ideas of republicanism, they believe what the Union should do is split into regions so that each region will have its own government reflecting the priorities of that particular region, rather than a union of all of them. And so that issue dominates John Jay's essays on the value and the benefits of union and the interdependence of one section on the other. And then Madison comes in with Federalist number 10, Hamilton, of course, with number 9 on domestic insurrection, and Madison with the issue of representation, and off we go. But the fact of the matter is, when you look at the results of the election in New York, and you realize that the Anti-Federalists win the majority of seats in the convention, 46-19, it's very obvious that Yates is making more headway than is Hamilton, than are the Federalist Papers. In fact, in one of the most revealing entries that I found in February 1788, an author named William North, I don't know anything about William North, but he makes a comment in one of the newspapers that the Publius articles, the articles related to the Federalist Papers, really aren't making much headway in New York because most people who read them can't understand them. They're written over the heads of the average citizen. And of course, we've talked about that. That's the whole point. If you remember Otto's letter, later in 1788, in October, Otto points out that New York Federalists specifically aimed the support of the campaign in the Federalist Papers over the heads of the average reader. They were directly to appeal to the people of position and influence in the state of New York, not to the average person. North makes clear in February that up to that point, the Federalist Papers are really not having much of an effect because most people who read them can't understand them. Yates is the one that's winning the day. And the proof is the election for delegates in New York, 46-19. The Anti-Federalists gain control of the ratifying convention. Once that happens and the ratifying convention meets, Yates then begins to write a different set of essays under the name Sidney. And throughout June, a series of Sidney articles appear written by Robert Yates, urging defeat on the part of the convention of the Constitution. Despite all of this, Yates refuses to make public his notes. Let me share one other thing with you that I find particularly informative. This is an issue raised in her book on ratification by Pauline Maier. A couple of years ago, let me get you the exact date of publication. 2010. In 2010, Pauline Maier published her book called Ratification. The People Debate the Constitution, 1787-1788. Pauline Maier gains access to the primary documents collected by John Kaminsky in Madison, Wisconsin, and uses those documents to address the issue of ratification in state after state after state in her 2010 award-winning book. In New York, she goes through the ratification convention, and she speaks specifically to the number of addresses, the visibility of Alexander Hamilton throughout the convention is worthy of comment. Hamilton speaks often and speaks long. He makes long speeches. In fact, at one point, he's accused let me find my quote, because I think this is an incredible contribution. There's a phrase at the time which becomes very popular. And that phrase refers to the fact that some of the speeches that are delivered are not impromptu. The speaker is not speaking off the cuff. Rather, the speaker is speaking from a speech that was written long before the time that it is delivered. Hamilton is accused of that. Hamilton is accused of taking the floor at the New York Convention and paraphrasing the Federalist Papers, speaking to what the Federalist Papers say in print. The phrase that Hamilton is accused of in these speeches is that his speeches are, quote, smelt of the lamp. And smelt of the lamp, S-M-E-L-T, smelled. The word they use is smelt. Smelt of the lamp means that they were pre-written, that they were speeches written for another time in another place. It's clear what Hamilton is doing is killing time. And that's the delay strategy that I mentioned earlier. During the debates on the Constitution on the issue of taxation, Hamilton delivers a long speech on the issue of the right of the new government to tax individual citizens. Up until this point, only the state governments under the Articles have the power to tax. But under the Constitution, the federal government as well would have that power. Many anti-federalists believe that this is the beginning of the end of the states. That once the federal government starts to tax citizens, states won't be able to. And if the states can't tax, then state governments will be in trouble. And that's why many of them believe that the ratification of the Constitution will destroy the states. And Hamilton gets on his feet at the ratifying convention and takes issue with that and talks about how important the states are to the Constitution and that the state ability to tax is not going to be negatively affected by the federal government's right to tax. Pauline Maier points out that having defended federal taxation to the extent of his power, Hamilton became exhausted. But before he ended his speech on taxation, he made what Pauline Maier calls, for him, an unusual apology. And here's what she says, quote, "He feared that from a warmth of feeling he had uttered expressions which might be too vehement. If so, his language came from the habit of using strong expressions and from the interesting nature of the subject. He had always condemned those cold, unfeeling hearts which no object can animate. Hamilton denied that ambition and self-interest had any part in his politics. If the gentlemen reckon me among the obnoxious few, he said, if they imagined that he sought immediate honors from government at the cost of the country's freedom, they should remember that he has close friends in his own children who would be among those oppressed by that same government." Immediately, John Lansing, the delegate at Philadelphia, mayor of Albany, jumps to his feet and comes down hard on Hamilton. And basically, he begins to quote Hamilton from what Hamilton said about taxation in Philadelphia at the Constitutional Convention. In other words, John Lansing breaks the secrecy vow by quoting chapter and verse of what Hamilton had said in the secrecy of the Philadelphia Convention. And it was exactly the opposite, Lansing said, of what he just told us. He just made a speech in which he wants us to believe that he respects the states. But in Philadelphia, he all but admitted that he wants to see the new government under the Constitution destroy the states, annihilate them. In reaction to what Lansing said, Pauline Maier reports that Hamilton was furious. He said he was not inconsistent. He didn't want to subvert the states. And then he said, quote, "It is highly improper and uncandid for Mr. Lansing to bring up arguments that I made in Philadelphia because of the oath of secrecy." At that point, John Lansing urges Yates to publish his minutes and said, "My colleague, Mr. Yates, took minutes. He can prove what Hamilton said in Philadelphia. And I urge Mr. Yates to make public his minutes." And then Lansing said, "The vote of secrecy we took in Philadelphia only lasted until the convention ended. Once the convention ended, the oath is no longer valid. Therefore, it's okay for Robert Yates to release his minutes." And Yates refuses to do it. In fact, what Yates does is call for an adjournment in order to bring to a close the heat of this argument. And Yates's minutes are never mentioned again. I believe that this is one hell of a story. I hope you agree. Maybe we can get back to this tomorrow. We're at the end of our time. We have to go today. But I wanted to, a couple of more things I'd like to say about the New York Ratifying Convention tomorrow. But that is tomorrow. Today is today, and we are now at the top of the hour. I want to thank you for your continued support of the Virtual Center and for your support of the Head On Radio Network of Bob Kincaid, Agnes, and the folks there. Thank you so very much for tuning in today. I hope you'll be back together, can join us again tomorrow. Remember, we'll be starting 30 minutes later tomorrow than we did today. For Head On Radio Network, and for me, as well as Bob Kincaid, thank you so very, very much. Have a wonderful rest of the day. Be kind to each other. And again, thank you.